The city skyline spread out before her like an intricate chessboard, with the glinting spires of Manhattan reaching for the sky, mirroring the sharp edges of her own life. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, Tori Hamilton could see it all. The sprawling streets below, the cars snaking through traffic, the endless pulse of a city that never stopped. But inside her apartment, a hollow quiet lingered, a silence that echoed in the chambers of her heart, where success and loneliness had coiled together like two opposing forces. Her fingers hovered over her smartphone, the glass screen reflecting her pensive expression. The text message on the screen was simple, yet it had the power to knock her breath from her chest. "Dear Tori, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to personally invite you to my wedding to Charlotte Davis. It would mean a lot to me if you could attend. Ethan." It had been years since she'd seen Ethan Carrington, the man who had once been everything to her, the man who had torn her world apart. A part of her wanted to throw the phone across the room, to discard the remnants of a past that she'd worked so hard to bury. But another part, the part that had never really let him go, could not resist. She had built an empire, a towering success in the tech world, but it had come at a cost. Somewhere along the way, Tori had sacrificed her own heart for the relentless pursuit of achievement. At 39, she was the founder and CEO of a multi-billion-dollar AI company, a household name in Silicon Valley. She had everything, except the one thing she once thought was worth more than anything: love. The letter in her hands felt heavier now, as if it were holding her in place, keeping her rooted to a past she had thought was behind her. She hadn't seen Ethan since their painful breakup, a slow unraveling that had ended when she realized the man she loved so fiercely had begun to love his career and family legacy more. The truth had come crashing down around them in the form of a lost child, a broken engagement, and an inevitable departure. Ethan had chosen his family's expectations over her, and she'd chosen herself. Or at least, that's what she'd told herself. "Do you think you should go?" Kara's voice broke through her thoughts. Tori hadn't realized her best friend had entered the room until Kara was sitting beside her, the weight of a glass of wine in her hand. Kara was the one who knew Tori best, the one who had witnessed both her meteoric rise and the quiet unraveling of her personal life. Kara was beautiful in a way that drew attention without trying, effortless, unapproachable, poised, the kind of woman who seemed to glide through life's most demanding moments with grace. But for all her composure, Kara had never understood Tori's obsession with perfection. "Go? Are you crazy?" Tori muttered, not really thinking about her words but letting them spill out. Kara leaned back against the sleek arm of the sofa, regarding her with the sort of calm that always made Tori feel like she was about to be judged, even if Kara never said a word. "You've never really gotten closure on him, have you?" Kara said quietly. "You were always so busy, focused on your career, on getting ahead. It was like you were avoiding him, avoiding yourself. And now, this." Tori swallowed hard. It wasn't like Kara to dig so deep, to reach into the places that Tori had worked so hard to lock away. She could feel the truth of it, the ache that still lived somewhere inside her, hidden beneath the armor of meetings and product launches, beneath the polished reputation of being a powerful woman who had everything under control. "Why now?" Tori finally managed to ask, lifting her gaze to meet Kara's. "Why would he invite me? After all these years? After everything?" Kara shrugged, her eyes glimmering with the kind of curiosity that had once driven Tori to seek out every possible way to climb higher. "Maybe he's trying to make things right, or maybe he's feeling guilty, or maybe he's just doing what people like him do, taking the easiest path to look good, to make amends where he thinks he owes them. I don't know." Kara paused, then added with a smirk. Or maybe he's still in love with you, and you're the one who can't see it. Tori's heart clenched. She had spent years convincing herself that Ethan's feelings for her had evaporated the moment he left, that it had been all about ambition, about the weight of family duty. But now, the possibility that he might still have feelings for her, after all this time, felt like a sharp needle poking through the protective layers she'd wrapped around herself. Tori closed her eyes, briefly pressing her palm to her forehead. The images came back to her unbidden. Ethan, smiling that smile that only he had, the way he'd made her feel like the most important person in the room. Then came the sting, the whispered accusations, the way he'd stepped back from her when it mattered most, and the child, the one they had never spoken about. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted quietly, the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. Kara's gaze softened, and she set the wine glass down. "You're never going to be ready, Tori, but that's not a reason to hide forever. Sometimes the thing that scares you the most is the thing you need to face. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is your chance to close the door on him, or open it and see what's still there." Tori shook her head, a faint laugh escaping her lips, though it didn't feel like humor. What if it's too late? What if he's moved on? Kara didn't reply immediately. She just watched Tori with the understanding only a close friend could have, patient, observant, and quietly knowing. "What if it isn't?" she finally said, her voice gentle. Tori stood up, her mind swirling with questions, with doubts, with the pull of a past she hadn't fully let go of. "I have to think about it," she said, more to herself than to Kara. The city outside was still alive, full of possibility and promises. But inside, the stillness settled in again, and Tori knew that this invitation, the one she could easily ignore, dismiss, or delete, was not just a note from an ex. It was a challenge, a crossroads that would either deepen her wounds or force her to heal. In the silence that followed, the weight of her decision settled in, heavier than any boardroom meeting, more intense than any stock market report. Ethan was waiting, and Tori was about to find out if she could leave the past behind, or if it would pull her back in. The days that followed the wedding invitation were a blur of busy meetings, endless conference calls, and product launches. But no matter how many hours she buried herself in her work, the invitation sat like an anchor in the back of her mind, impossible to ignore. Tori hadn't made a decision yet, but every time her gaze lingered on the gold-embossed envelope sitting on her kitchen counter, a soft but insistent pull seemed to tug at her heart. It was as if the past refused to remain buried, ready to resurface whether she was prepared or not. Tori's office was immaculate, just as her life had always been, precise, controlled, and well-ordered. Yet today, the walls of her glass-walled conference room felt like they were closing in. The skyline outside, normally a source of inspiration, seemed distant and cold. Ethan's name still loomed over her thoughts, his presence impossible to escape. She glanced at the clock. 2:45 p.m. A reminder popped up on her phone. Meeting with Daniel, 3 p.m., new AI contract review. Tori stood up, smoothing the hem of her black blazer, trying to shake the lingering weight in her chest. It wasn't about the meeting. It was about everything else. She could almost hear Ethan's voice in her head again, his easy charm, his belief that they would conquer everything together before it all fell apart. She had to admit, part of her was still angry with him. But another part, the part she rarely let out, missed him in a way that went beyond simple nostalgia. She missed the way he made her laugh, the way he'd held her when the world seemed to be falling apart. The sound of her office door opening snapped her from her thoughts. Daniel stepped inside, his usual calm presence a welcome interruption. He was younger than her by a few years, but wise beyond his age, having been by her side since the beginning. His loyalty had never wavered, and his advice had always been measured, never too forceful, but always sensible. He'd been a constant in her life, her anchor, and lately, a voice of reason she was grateful for. "Hey, Danny," she said with a faint smile, using the nickname she'd given him years ago. "How's the AI contract coming along?" Daniel slid into the chair across from her, his dark eyes sharp but sympathetic. "I'm doing fine, Tori," he said, but it was clear he wasn't here just to discuss business. "But I can tell something's on your mind. You've been distracted all week." Tori sighed, running a hand through her hair. She'd never been good at hiding things from Daniel. He'd known her too long, seen her at her best and her worst. "I got an invitation," she said, looking at him for the first time. "From Ethan." The name seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with history. Daniel's expression softened, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "Ethan Carrington? The Ethan Carrington? The one who—" He stopped himself, the words not needing to be said. Tori nodded, her gaze falling to the desk. "Yeah, he's getting married to Charlotte Davis. The invitation came out of nowhere. I don't even know why he's inviting me, honestly." Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering her words carefully. "You and Ethan—" He trailed off, his voice more thoughtful now. "It ended badly, didn't it?" Tori stiffened, her fingers instinctively tapping the edge of her desk. "It wasn't just bad, Daniel. It was a mess. He chose his family, his legacy, over me, over us. And after that, after everything, I built this life. I built this. I don't need him to be part of it." Her voice faltered just slightly, a crack in her armor that she quickly closed. But Daniel wasn't finished. "I get that. But I also see the way you've been looking at that invitation. I've never seen you this—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Conflicted." Tori's heart rate picked up. She hated that Daniel could read her so well. He was always able to cut through her walls, even when she didn't want him to. And right now he could see the truth. The invitation wasn't just an old flame reaching out. It was an unanswered question, a thread left hanging in the past. "You're right," Tori said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do. On one hand, I want to burn the invitation, forget everything about him. But on the other, I don't know, Daniel. What if I'm wrong? What if everything I've built, everything I've become, it's just been me running away from something I couldn't fix?" Daniel met her gaze with his steady, unflinching look. "Tori, I've known you long enough to see how hard you've fought to build the life you have. But you've also fought harder to avoid the things that matter most to you. Ethan wasn't just a business decision or a career choice. He was part of you. And maybe, just maybe, the woman you are today, the one who's built all this, she still needs some answers." Tori swallowed, the words landing deep within her, stirring something she didn't want to confront. Was Daniel right? Had she been running all this time? Running from Ethan? Running from herself? "Do you think I should go?" she asked, finally letting the question out loud, even though she wasn't ready for the answer. Daniel paused for a long moment, studying her face, as though he were seeing her in a new light. "I think you should go if you want to, Tori. If you think you'll get the answers you need, and if you're ready to face whatever comes next." The weight of the decision bore down on her chest. The truth was, she wasn't sure she was ready. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel gave her a small smile, his eyes twinkling with understanding. "I know you will, but whatever you decide, just remember that you've built this life, this success, on your own. No one can take that from you. And no matter what happens with Ethan, that doesn't change." Tori looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Daniel had always been her rock, the person who believed in her when she could barely believe in herself. "Thanks, Danny," she said softly. "I needed that." As he stood and left the room, Tori sat back in her chair, her fingers running over the edge of her desk. The invitation was still there, still waiting. Ethan's name, once a distant memory, now loomed before her like a ghost she could neither embrace nor outrun. For the first time in years, Tori felt the tightrope she was walking, teetering between the past and the future. Would she face Ethan? Would she allow herself to return to that chapter of her life, with all its complicated love and unresolved pain? Or would she bury it all, once and for all? The answer would come soon enough. The week crawled by, each day stretching longer than the last. Tori tried to focus on her work, she always did, but the invitation from Ethan lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Every time she glanced at the glossy envelope sitting on her kitchen counter, a knot twisted tighter in her stomach. She had always been the one who controlled her emotions, her career, her future. She prided herself on not being swept away by feelings, but this invitation, this unexpected reach across time, had the power to unravel everything. Tori sat at her sleek glass desk, reviewing financial reports for a new AI product her company was about to release. Numbers, projections, growth, these things should have absorbed her mind. But as her eyes skimmed the pages, her thoughts drifted back to Ethan. Ethan Carrington. The name still carried weight, a mixture of love, loss, and regret, all tangled up in a past she had worked hard to leave behind. The memory of his smile, that first kiss, the way he'd held her on their last night together, all of it came rushing back in waves she could never fully control. She had never told anyone the full truth about their breakup, not even Kara. It wasn't just that Ethan had chosen his family's legacy over her. It was that he'd never truly understood her ambition, her need to carve out a place for herself. The world of power and wealth they inhabited had always been too small for both of them. Or maybe it wasn't small enough. They had suffocated under the weight of their own expectations. But then Jamie, her son, had come into the picture. Tori could never forget the pain of raising him alone, of knowing that Ethan would never be a part of his life. She had accepted that, or at least she thought she had. Her fingers hovered over the phone. She was about to text Kara, tell her she'd made up her mind, that she was going to the wedding. The words almost came out of her with ease, but she hesitated. What was she doing? Was this about closure? Or something deeper? What did she even want from Ethan after all these years? The phone rang, breaking her train of thought. It was Kara. "Hey, I know what you're thinking." Kara's voice was light, but there was an underlying tone that suggested she wasn't buying Tori's act of indifference. "You're going to go, aren't you?" Tori smiled despite herself. "You're awfully confident." "Only because I know you," Kara said, a teasing note in her voice. "I know you've been pretending not to care, but you're as human as the rest of us, Tori, and as much as you've buried that part of yourself, it's still there. The part that misses him, the part that wonders what might have been." Tori leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the skyline outside her office. The weight of her own vulnerability hit her harder than she expected. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I've built this life for myself, Kara. I've worked so damn hard. And for what? To have it all come crashing down because of a mistake I made with him?" Kara was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "Tori, you've built something. You've done more than most people could ever dream. But that doesn't mean you have to be a machine, just because you're good at it. You're allowed to feel things. You're allowed to want answers. And you're allowed to want to close the door on your past. but sometimes that requires facing it head-on. The words hung in the air. They felt true, too true. And yet the idea of facing Ethan again, of seeing him at his wedding, made her stomach churn. Could she really go back to that place? Could she stand there, pretending everything was fine? Pretending that the last 10 years hadn't been filled with ache and self-doubt? Kara's voice broke through her thoughts again, firm and knowing. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But if you keep running from him, running from that pain, you'll always wonder. You'll always wonder if there's something you missed, something you could have done differently. Tori closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pushing against her chest. The city, the success, the empire she had built. None of it mattered when it came to Ethan. She knew that now. What she was really afraid of was seeing him, hearing his voice again, and realizing how much she'd changed, how much they both had changed. But then there was Jamie, her son, the boy who never asked for this, who never asked to grow up without his father. Tori had promised herself that she would give Jamie the best life possible, even if that meant keeping Ethan out of it. But what if the answer wasn't about keeping Ethan away? What if there was a way to heal, to make sense of the past, so that Jamie didn't have to grow up with so many questions? Okay, Tori said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll go. Kara let out a relieved sigh on the other end. I knew you would. You're stronger than you think, Tori. The words didn't comfort her, but they didn't have to. This wasn't about strength anymore. It was about facing the truth, about coming face to face with a past that had been left unresolved for far too long. After hanging up, Tori took a deep breath and looked at the invitation again. It still felt like a weight in her hands, but she knew what she had to do. She'd put it off long enough. Now she had to find the courage to step into that room, to stand beside Ethan, and to face whatever ghosts from their shared history came rushing back. As she gathered her things to leave the office for the day, a thought lingered in her mind, one that she couldn't quite shake. What if the past didn't need to be buried anymore? What if there was a way to move forward without running from it? The truth was, she didn't know. But maybe, just maybe, Ethan could help her find out. Tori stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting the hem of her dress one last time. The deep emerald green fabric clung to her curves, a subtle elegance that reflected both her strength and her vulnerability. Her makeup was minimal but flawless. Her hair swept into a smooth chignon that left her face open and unguarded. Everything was carefully arranged, just like her life, just like the empire she had built. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt unsure. The invitation had seemed so simple at first, a polite gesture. But now, as she prepared for the wedding, the weight of the decision to attend settled heavily on her shoulders. Tori wasn't one to second-guess herself, but something about this felt different. There was no business deal at stake here, no strategic partnership to manage. This was personal. This was about love, loss, and the unresolved ache of a past that had never truly let her go. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence in the room. It was a message from Kara. You've got this. Just breathe. It's not about the past. It's about your future. Tori stared at the message for a moment, the words comforting but also stirring something deeper within her. It's about your future. Tori knew Kara was right in some ways. The future was what she'd always focused on, what had driven her to work late into the night, to push harder than anyone else. The future was why she had built this company, why she had fought to stay strong even when it felt like everything around her was falling apart. But standing at the threshold of the wedding, she couldn't help but wonder if the future she had created was truly the one she wanted, or if, perhaps, it was just a fortress she had built to protect herself from facing the past. She took a deep breath and slipped her phone into her bag. The decision was made. She was going. She wasn't going to let herself be ruled by fear or by the ghosts of a relationship that had never truly been resolved. She wasn't going to hide anymore. The drive to the venue felt surreal. The streets of Manhattan rushed by in a blur of yellow taxis and shimmering glass buildings, each corner of the city a reminder of how far she had come, how much she had achieved. Yet none of it seemed to matter as much as the thought of Ethan. What had happened to them? What had they been? And what could they possibly be now after all this time? The wedding was being held at a grand ballroom on the Upper East Side. As the car pulled up to the entrance, Tori felt a flicker of hesitation. It was a beautiful space, the kind of place reserved for the elite, a perfect setting for Ethan's grand affair. She could already hear the laughter and chatter of the guests inside, their voices floating through the heavy doors. Tori stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the entrance, and she felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into her bones. She had done this 1,000 times before, stepping into high-profile events, gracing the arms of powerful men, shaking hands with billionaires and celebrities. But this was different. As she walked into the ballroom, Tori's gaze immediately found Ethan. He was standing near the front, his back to her, but she recognized the way he carried himself instantly. Even from behind, she could see the broad shoulders, the tall frame, the sharp lines of his suit that spoke of wealth and power. But it was the way he stood, slightly stiff, slightly unsure, that made her heart skip. For a moment she wondered if he had been waiting for her, if he had known she would come. And then he turned. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a fleeting second, it felt like time had stopped. His expression was unreadable, an unreadable mask he'd perfected over the years, but Tori could see the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was there, like a spark just beneath the surface, something unspoken, but undeniable. She didn't know whether to approach him or turn and walk away. The pull between them was magnetic, but it was also dangerous. How many years had passed since they'd last seen each other? How much had changed in their lives? Tori stood still for a moment, watching him, as if searching for some sign that everything could be different this time. But as she looked at Ethan, standing in the midst of his world, surrounded by wealth, success, and Charlotte, his bride-to-be, she realized that she had no idea who he was anymore. Before she could make a decision, a voice called her name. "Tori, you made it!" Tori turned to find Kara approaching, her smile bright and knowing. Kara was as effortlessly chic as ever, her hair styled in loose waves that framed her face perfectly. Kara had been encouraging her to come, pushing her to face the truth, but now there was something in her eyes that made Tori hesitate. "I knew you'd show up," Kara said, pulling Tori into a brief hug. "You always do the right thing, even when it's hard." Tori didn't reply immediately, still trying to compose herself. The room felt suffocating now, the noise of the celebration a dull hum in the background. All she could focus on was Ethan, standing at the front, as though the world had shifted around them, and everything was about to fall into place, or fall apart. "I can't believe I'm here," Tori finally said, glancing at Kara. "I feel like I'm walking into a trap." Kara raised an eyebrow. "A trap? Come on, this isn't a trap. This is closure if you want it. Or maybe it's a new beginning. Who knows? But you can't keep running from him, Tori." Tori nodded, her chest tight. Kara was right. She wasn't running anymore. But as her eyes flickered back to Ethan, the questions only deepened. What did he want? And more importantly, what did she want? Before she could answer her own question, someone tapped her shoulder. "Excuse me, Miss Hamilton?" Tori turned to find a man in a tuxedo standing behind her, holding a glass of champagne. He was one of the event staff, a polite smile on his face, but there was something about his presence that made her uneasy. "Mr. Carrington would like to speak with you," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Tori's heart stuttered. She didn't have to ask why. She knew exactly what he wanted. It was time. The tension between them was no longer just a whisper in the back of her mind. It was right there in the room, unavoidable. Tori had made the decision to come. Now the only question left was whether she could face Ethan and the truth head on. Tori followed the staff member through the lavish ballroom, her heels clicking on the polished marble floors, a steady beat that matched the pounding of her heart. The noise of the wedding celebration, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, the soft strains of a string quartet, faded into the background as she moved toward the far side of the room. The further she walked, the more surreal everything felt, like she was stepping into a scene she had no place in. She had never imagined herself here, in this place, standing on the precipice of a reunion with Ethan. The decision to attend had felt like the right one in theory, but now that she was actually moving toward him, everything felt uncertain. Would she find closure? Would she find peace? Or was she just walking into another chapter of disappointment and regret? The staff member paused at the entrance of a small, quiet alcove, his polite demeanor never faltering. "Mr. Carrington is expecting you," he said softly, then disappeared into the crowd, leaving Tori alone. She took a steadying breath before stepping inside. There, standing by the windows, his back turned to her, was Ethan. He looked just as she remembered, tall, commanding, his dark hair neatly combed, his posture perfect. But there was a stiffness to him, a tightness in his shoulders that Tori had never noticed before. For a moment, he seemed to be lost in thought, unaware of her presence, and then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. Tori's breath caught in her throat. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the briefest of moments, time seemed to freeze. She saw the faintest flicker of surprise, but also something else, something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "Tori." Ethan's voice was low, hesitant, but there was a warmth to it that hadn't been there all those years ago. It was as though the walls between them, the ones they had both built so high, were crumbling in the span of a heartbeat. "Ethan," she managed, her voice almost a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to say anything else, not yet. She wasn't sure if she even had the right words. They stood there for a moment, in an uncomfortable silence that stretched on too long. The world outside the alcove continued its whirl of laughter and celebration, but inside, all Tori could focus on was the man before her, the man who had once been her everything, and now seemed like a stranger. "I didn't think you'd come," Ethan said finally, his gaze searching her face. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." Tori's heart skipped, but she held her ground. "You invited me," she replied coolly, though the words didn't feel as sharp as she wanted them to. "What did you expect? For me to ignore it?" Ethan's eyes softened, and Tori could see the flicker of regret there. Regret for the years that had passed, for the way things had ended between them. But also something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Was it guilt? Was it love? "I didn't know if you'd want to be here," he said, stepping a little closer to her, his voice low. "After everything." Tori couldn't suppress the laugh that escaped her, though it wasn't one of amusement. It was bitter, and it surprised even her. "Ethan, after everything? What do you mean by that? After everything?" Her words hung in the air between them, thick with the unspoken history of their relationship, the love they had once shared, the way they had both let go of it, the moments they had lost one by one, until nothing was left but memories. "I know I hurt you," Ethan said quietly, his voice almost a plea. "I've regretted it every single day, but I was young, Tori. I didn't understand what I had until it was gone." Tori closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly as the old pain resurfaced. She had spent years convincing herself that she had moved on, that she was stronger than the woman who had fallen in love with Ethan Carrington. And yet, standing here now, facing him, she could feel all the old emotions rushing back: anger, sadness, and yes, a lingering trace of the love she had once felt so fiercely. "You didn't understand?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You didn't understand that I needed you? That I was doing everything I could to make us work, to make a life with you? And then you just walked away." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't stop them. The dam she'd built over the years had cracked, and the emotions she had kept bottled inside were flooding back. Ethan's eyes darkened with what could only be described as guilt. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Tori. I didn't mean to leave you alone." Tori blinked back the sudden sting of tears, refusing to let herself go there. Not now, not here. She'd spent too many years hiding her feelings, pretending she was fine, pretending she didn't need him. But in this moment, the truth was undeniable. She had needed him, and she still wasn't sure if that need had ever fully gone away. "You left me with a baby, Ethan. With Jamie," she said, her voice breaking just slightly as she spoke her son's name. "I raised him alone. Alone. Do you know what that's been like? To watch him grow up and wonder why his father didn't care enough to be there? To build a life around the pieces of what we were, trying to pretend that I was okay when I wasn't?" Ethan's face paled, and for a moment, Tori saw the cracks in his facade. He had never truly understood the weight of what he had walked away from, not until now, not until he saw the woman standing before him, the woman who had carried their child, raised him, struggled alone. "I didn't know, Tori," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know you were carrying Jamie. I didn't know you were pregnant when we ended. I thought you were—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought, his eyes searching hers in disbelief. Tori took a sharp breath, her heart pounding. "You didn't know?" she echoed, stunned. "You didn't know about Jamie? She faltered, the world spinning as the pieces of the past clicked together in a way she hadn't expected. She had always thought that Ethan had known. She had never once considered that he might not have. "You didn't know?" The question lingered in the air between them, heavy with the weight of years lost and a truth Tori had never fully allowed herself to understand. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with an apology so deep it nearly broke her. "I never knew, Tori. I never knew." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, as Tori realized the truth that had been buried all this time. The truth that would change everything. The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air between them, thick with the implication of everything that had been left unsaid for years. Tori stood there, her mind racing to process what he had just revealed. He didn't know. She had spent years believing that Ethan had known about Jamie, that he had chosen not to be a part of their son's life. It had been the core of her anger, the reason for so much of her bitterness toward him. How could he walk away so easily? How could he not care? But now, in the space between them, she saw the truth. His truth. His eyes weren't filled with the practiced indifference of a man who had turned his back on his responsibilities. They were filled with shock, with guilt, with the kind of regret that made her feel like everything she'd assumed was wrong. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The music from the wedding reception filtered in from the ballroom, muffled and distant. Guests were still mingling, glasses clinking, laughter rising like bubbles in champagne. But in this moment, there was only silence between Tori and Ethan, broken only by the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. Tori opened her mouth, but no words came out. She couldn't process it all at once. The anger, the hurt, the relief. How could she have been so sure? How could she have built her entire world on the assumption that Ethan had known about Jamie and had chosen to stay away? "You never knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She needed to hear it again, needed to make sense of what he was telling her. Ethan stepped closer, his hands lifting slightly, as if reaching out, but he stopped himself, unsure. He was as unsure as she was, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them, unsure of how to begin making amends for something as enormous as this. "No," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear, Tori, I didn't know. I thought you didn't want me involved. I thought after everything, you didn't want me near you or our son." His voice cracked on the last word, and Tori felt the rawness in it, the truth that had been buried in him, just as much as it had been buried in her. Her breath hitched. "I thought you left because you didn't care. I thought you abandoned us because I wasn't enough." The words spilled out of her before she could stop them, the pain of those years rushing to the surface. "I didn't know how to do it on my own, Ethan. I didn't know how to be both mother and father to him. And I blamed you. I blamed you for everything." Ethan's face softened, the lines of guilt etched deeply in his features. "I never wanted to abandon you. Never." He paused, his hand running through his hair as if trying to make sense of his own words. "I don't know why you didn't tell me, but I thought you didn't need me. I thought you had moved on, that you were better off without me, and I couldn't." He stopped, shaking his head as if the words were too difficult to say. "I couldn't come back, not when I didn't think you wanted me. I thought I was the last thing you needed." Tori's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. The past, with all its questions and assumptions, was now crumbling around her. She had lived with that hurt for so long, convinced that Ethan had made a choice, and now she realized it wasn't a choice at all. It had been a misunderstanding, a massive chasm between them built on silence and fear. "I didn't know," Tori murmured, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. She shook her head, as if trying to shake the confusion away. "I didn't know you didn't know." Ethan looked at her, his gaze softening, almost apologetic. "I would have done things differently. I would have fought for you, for our son, if I'd known. I wasn't the man I should have been, Tori, but I am now. I swear to you, I would have been there. I wanted to be there." The sincerity in his voice pierced through the layers of anger and resentment Tori had carried for so long. She had built her wall so high, convinced herself that she was better off without him, that she could never forgive him. But now, standing here, she realized how much of that pain had been based on assumptions, on something that wasn't even true. "You would have been there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She was too afraid to believe it, too afraid to hope that this moment, this unexpected truth, could be the beginning of something real between them. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was an idiot, Tori. A selfish, arrogant idiot who let fear and pride get in the way. But I'm not that man anymore. I can't change the past, but I can be part of the future if you'll let me." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. Tori had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on being the one to move forward, to take control of her life. But the truth was, she had never stopped needing him. And the more she heard him speak, the more she realized how much she had held on to, how much of her pain had been because of the unspoken things between them. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Ethan," she said, the words coming out slower, more carefully now. "I don't know if I can let you back in. I've spent so many years building a life without you, and I don't know how to let go of all the anger, all the hurt, all the fear." Ethan's gaze hardened slightly, but it wasn't with anger. It was with determination. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, Tori. I don't expect you to just forget everything we've been through. But if you can see the man I am now, if you can see how much I regret the past and how much I want to make it right, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove it to you. The sincerity in his voice echoed deep within her. Could she really believe that things could be different? Could she truly open her heart to the possibility of him again, after everything that had happened? A soft voice interrupted their fragile moment. Tori? It was a child's voice, small, tentative but unmistakable. Tori turned sharply to see Jamie standing in the doorway of the alcove. His wide eyes locked onto hers, and her heart stopped for a second. He looked so much like Ethan. So much like him. Jamie? Tori breathed, moving toward him instinctively. He stepped into the room slowly, his eyes darting between her and Ethan. Are you my dad's friend? He asked, his voice soft but curious. Tori looked at Ethan, who stood frozen, his gaze filled with an unspoken question. This was it. The moment that would change everything. Tori's heart skipped a beat at the sight of Jamie. Her son, her precious boy, was standing there, his small frame framed by the doorway, his innocent eyes wide and filled with curiosity. He was just like Ethan, just like him, but also entirely his own person. The way his hair fell across his forehead, the slight quirk of his lips as he looked between her and Ethan, it was uncanny. Tori felt a wave of emotions crash over her, guilt, surprise, and something far more tender. Jamie had never known his father. She had kept Ethan's identity from him, as if shielding him from a past that hadn't worked out. But now, seeing the boy stand there, so much like Ethan, it made her question everything. Was she wrong to keep Jamie from the truth? Could she have given him more than just a single parent? She turned to Ethan, her eyes searching his face. His expression was a mixture of shock and awe, his eyes locked on Jamie, as if he was seeing the physical proof of his past mistakes for the first time. Tori couldn't read him completely. His emotions were too complicated, too tangled with the years that had passed. But there was no mistaking the tremor in his voice when he spoke. Jamie, Ethan whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. His gaze remained fixed on the boy, like he was trying to reconcile the image before him with the memories that had always been vague, distant. You're mine? Tori's breath hitched at the words, the implication sinking deep into her chest. For years, she had told herself Ethan had chosen not to be a part of Jamie's life. But standing here now, hearing Ethan ask the question, she realized just how much he had missed. He hadn't been given the chance to choose. He'd been left in the dark as much as Jamie had. Jamie didn't say anything right away. Instead, he looked at Tori, his small face filled with uncertainty. Is he my dad? His voice was tentative, childlike, but there was a quiet, undeniable curiosity in it that made Tori's heart ache. Tori knelt down to his level, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Jamie, sweetheart, this is... She hesitated. Was she ready for this? Could she even explain it to him? She looked at Ethan, who stood frozen, his hands at his sides as though unsure whether to approach or not. Ethan took a slow, cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving Jamie. Yes, buddy, he said, his voice low but steady. I am. I'm your dad. Tori held her breath, watching the exchange unfold between father and son. Jamie looked up at Ethan, his face still unsure, but then something in his eyes softened. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to make sense of this strange revelation. Dad. Jamie repeated the word softly, testing it, tasting it, as if he were trying to see if it fit. "I've never had a dad before." The words hit Tori like a physical blow. The reality of the moment, the pain of all those years spent without a father, without Ethan in Jamie's life, was suddenly overwhelming. She felt the weight of it all, the loneliness Jamie had felt, the questions he had asked, the pieces of his life that had never quite fit. Ethan seemed to feel the same thing. His expression softened, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he crouched down in front of Jamie, his hands shaking just slightly as he reached for the boy. "I'm so sorry," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I never knew, Jamie. I never meant to be gone. I'm sorry I wasn't there." Tori watched as Jamie looked at Ethan for a moment, his brow furrowing in that thoughtful way only children could manage. Then, almost as if to break the tension, Jamie smiled, a small, tentative smile that lit up his face. "It's okay," he said, as though forgiving Ethan without truly understanding the depth of what he had said. Tori felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had never realized how much she had kept from Jamie, how much of the truth she had hidden in an attempt to protect him. But now, looking at them both, Ethan, this stranger who was also his father, and Jamie, the son who had never known him, she felt the ground beneath her shift. This was no longer just about the past. It was about the future. Ethan reached out slowly, his hand trembling just slightly, as he placed it on Jamie's shoulder. The gesture was hesitant at first, as if he wasn't sure if he had the right, if he had earned it. But when Jamie didn't pull away, when he looked up at Ethan with that curious, open gaze, Ethan's face softened, a tear brimming at the corner of his eye. "I don't know how to fix everything," Ethan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll try. I'll try for you. For both of you." Tori stood back, watching the moment unfold before her, feeling the gravity of it all. She had always thought that she could protect Jamie from the pain of their fractured past. But here, now, she realized that the real healing wasn't just about the past, it was about moving forward. She could no longer shield Jamie from the truth, and maybe, just maybe, the truth would set them all free. Ethan stood up, turning to face Tori, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in him for years: vulnerability. His face was lined with regret, but also with a kind of hope that she hadn't expected. "I know I can't erase the past, Tori," he said quietly, his gaze intense. "But I want to be part of the future, if you'll let me." Tori took a deep breath, her mind racing, her emotions still raw and unsettled. Could she really let him back in? Could she open her heart again to the man who had walked away so easily all those years ago? The silence between them was heavy, thick with the weight of what had been lost and what might still be possible. But as she looked at Ethan, at the man standing before her, uncertain but determined, hopeful but broken, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep running from the truth. "I don't know if I'm ready," Tori said softly, her voice wavering, but she didn't look away from him. "But I'm willing to try. For him. For us." Ethan nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's all I ask." And for the first time in a long time, Tori allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Not just for her, but for their family, for Jamie, and for the life that had been waiting to be rebuilt. The next few days after the wedding felt like a strange limbo, suspended between the past and the future. Tori had barely slept since that evening. The events of the wedding, the raw conversation with Ethan, and the revelation about Jamie kept running through her mind like a movie she couldn't pause or rewind. Everything had shifted, and yet nothing felt certain. The city felt different somehow. The glass towers and sleek skyscrapers that once inspired her now seemed cold, distant. Tori stood by her window in the penthouse, watching the lights of the city blink on one by one as dusk descended. The skyline, so familiar, now felt alien to her, like she was looking at it through someone else's eyes. The weight of the past few days pressed on her chest. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down to see a message from Kara. "I haven't heard from you in days. We need to talk. You okay?" Tori didn't respond immediately. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keys. Talk? How could she explain it all? How could she put into words what had happened? That she was on the verge of confronting a life she thought she had already moved on from? That Ethan, the man she had once loved and blamed for everything, was suddenly back in her life, and not just as an ex, but as Jamie's father. She hadn't been able to face Kara. The conversation about Ethan, about Jamie, had left her drained and confused, and she hadn't yet found the words to express how much her world had been turned upside down. With a sigh, Tori sat down on the couch, pulling the thick blanket around her shoulders for warmth. She needed to think. She needed clarity. Her mind kept circling back to the conversation with Ethan. His apologies, his guilt, his genuine desire to make things right, to be part of their lives again. He wants to be part of our future, she reminded herself. But was she ready to let him? Was she ready to reopen that door, knowing how painful and complicated it could be? And Jamie, the boy who had spent years without a father, now suddenly had one. Tori watched Jamie closely in the days following the wedding, and she saw something in him that hadn't been there before. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor, more confidence, more curiosity. A part of her was afraid to let herself feel hopeful, to believe that Ethan could be the father Jamie needed. The reality was too complicated. The world they lived in, the world Tori had fought to create, was far from ordinary. Ethan had stepped back into her life, but not as the man she once knew. He was no longer just the ambitious young man chasing his family's legacy. He was a wealthy, powerful figure in his own right, with responsibilities, expectations, and a future that didn't belong to just him. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Daniel, her right-hand man at the company. She answered it with a sense of dread, knowing he wasn't calling for small talk. "Tori, we need to talk about the merger," Daniel said, his voice businesslike but laced with concern. "The deal's hitting some roadblocks. We need your input, your presence. There's pressure from the board, and it's getting tight." Tori closed her eyes, trying to push down the rising tide of anxiety. She had been avoiding work lately, her mind preoccupied with everything else. The last thing she wanted to deal with was a complicated business negotiation, but she knew she had no choice. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. "Good. We'll meet at the office in an hour." The call ended and Tori leaned back against the couch, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. How was she supposed to navigate everything, Ethan, Jamie, the company? Her entire life had been a balancing act, but now the stakes felt higher than ever. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. She had built an empire, but at what cost? Had she sacrificed everything for her career? She had never been one to let personal matters interfere with her professional life. But with Ethan in the picture now, with Jamie's future hanging in the balance, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. At the office, the familiar hum of activity filled the air as Tori stepped into the conference room. Daniel was already there, along with a few senior team members, all of them looking expectantly at her. The tension in the room was palpable. "Tori," Daniel greeted her, his tone neutral, "we need your signature on the revised terms. The board is pushing for a faster timeline. It's critical for our market position." Tori nodded, taking her seat at the head of the table, her mind still swirling with thoughts of Ethan and Jamie. She focused on the contracts in front of her, trying to channel all her energy into the task at hand. But even as she signed the papers, even as she made strategic decisions to keep the merger on track, part of her mind was with Ethan. The pressure of being both a CEO and a mother, of balancing her ambitions with the responsibilities she now had as Jamie's only parent, felt like too much. She had spent years constructing this life, this powerful persona, as a self-made billionaire. And yet, in a single moment, the future she had worked so hard for now felt fragile, as if it could all come crashing down. As the meeting ended, Daniel lingered behind, his expression thoughtful. "Tori," he said, his voice lowering as the others filed out. "How are you holding up? You've been distracted. Is everything okay?" Tori met his gaze, feeling the weight of his concern. Daniel had been with her through every high and low of her career. He knew her better than most. "I don't know, Danny," she confessed quietly. "I don't know if I can do all of this anymore. The business, the pressure, being everything to Jamie, and now with Ethan. I thought I had everything under control, but I feel like I'm losing myself." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened. "You've built something incredible, Tori, but don't forget, you don't have to do it all alone. You've got people who care about you, people who can help. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself." Her chest tightened at his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe, for the first time in years, she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. But could she trust Ethan enough to let him back in? Could she give him the chance to prove that he was ready to be the father Jamie needed, or would his ambition pull him away once more? The decisions felt impossible. The future, once so clear, now seemed filled with uncertainty. And yet, the weight of the decision had never felt more important. The next few days passed in a blur, the weight of the choices before Tori pressing down on her like an invisible force. She had made strides in business, her mind sharp as ever when it came to negotiations and mergers. But when the day ended and the office lights dimmed, the walls of her penthouse felt unbearably silent. It was as if the very foundation of her life had shifted. Everything she had built, every decision she had made, now seemed to hang in a delicate balance, teetering between what was and what could be. Jamie, as always, was a bright spot in the chaos. The boy had been quieter than usual, still adjusting to the revelation that his father was now in his life. His interactions with Ethan had been tentative, cautious, but there was something in Jamie's eyes, a flicker of hope perhaps, or the spark of a bond that had been waiting to ignite. Tori couldn't help but watch them, feeling a strange mixture of relief and fear. Ethan had made no promises, but the sincerity in his voice when he'd spoken to Jamie that day at the wedding had been enough to stir something inside her. Ethan wasn't the man he had once been. That much was clear. But could he really be the man they needed now? Could he fit into the world Tori had built, where control was everything and vulnerability was a luxury? And more importantly, could he find a way to balance his ambitious, ever-expanding empire with the life he had once walked away from? Old Jay. The question haunted her as she sat at her kitchen island, staring at the untouched glass of wine in front of her. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ethan. "Can we talk tomorrow? I need to explain more. I need to show you how committed I am to making things right. For you, for Jamie, for us." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. For us. That small phrase, so simple, yet so loaded with meaning, stirred something in her. Was she truly ready for that? To let go of the past? To open her heart again to a man who had never once considered the cost of his absence? Her finger hovered over the keyboard, ready to type something, anything, back. But the response never came. She couldn't find the words. The decision wasn't as simple as accepting his apology. It was about trusting him, about rebuilding a life they'd lost. A soft knock at the door startled her. Tori stood up quickly, smoothing her hair before walking toward the entrance. When she opened it, she found Jamie standing in the hallway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hey, buddy," Tori said, her voice softening. "What's up?" Jamie hesitated, his eyes darting away for a moment before meeting her gaze. I'm okay. I just wanted to ask you something." "Of course, come on in," Tori said, stepping aside to let him in. She could tell something was on his mind. He had been quieter lately, more introspective, as though trying to understand the whirlwind of changes in his life. She had expected questions about Ethan, about his past, about why his father had stayed away. But she didn't know how to answer those questions yet, not when she was still trying to understand them herself. Jamie sat down on the couch, dropping his bag beside him. He fiddled with the straps, his eyes cast downward. Tori sat beside him, her heart tightening. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Jamie asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, sweetheart," Tori said, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. He paused for a moment, clearly searching for the right words. "I don't really know what to think about Dad. I mean, I don't know him. But he seems nice. Is he really going to stay?" Tori took a deep breath, her chest tight. This was the conversation she had been avoiding. The one she hadn't been ready for, but knew was inevitable. Jamie needed answers, and she had to give them to him. She reached out, gently taking Jamie's hand in hers. "Your dad wants to stay, Jamie. He wants to be here for you, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to take time for both of you to figure out how to be together. But he wants to try." Jamie looked up at her, his expression serious. "You don't have to do everything on your own anymore, Mom. You've done so much for me, but you don't have to keep everything inside." Tori's heart swelled with love for her son, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe. Jamie had always been her anchor, the one person who had kept her grounded, and yet here he was, showing the wisdom of someone far beyond his years. Tori squeezed his hand. "You're right, sweetie. I don't have to do everything alone. But it's hard to let people in sometimes, you know, even when they want to help." Jamie nodded, his eyes softening. "It's okay. I think I'm ready. I just want to know that I'm not going to lose you." The words struck Tori deeply. She had spent so much of her life focusing on what she could control, her career, her success, but she had never stopped to ask what Jamie truly needed from her, from them. She had tried to protect him from the pain of not having Ethan around, but in doing so, she had kept him from the possibility of something more. "I'm not going anywhere, Jamie," she said, her voice firm with love. "I'm here. I'll always be here. And I'll always do what's best for you. We'll figure this out, together." The weight of her promise settled in her chest, but something else, something lighter began to fill the space. The smallest sense of hope. The future, once so uncertain, now felt like a path that could be navigated, one step at a time. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be obstacles, fears to confront, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, Tori allowed herself to imagine a different kind of future. A future where she wasn't alone, where Ethan could be part of their family, and where they could build something new from the ruins of the past. "Thanks, Mom," Jamie said softly, leaning against her. "I think I'm ready, too." Tori smiled, her heart swelling with love for the son she had raised, and for the possibility of the future they could build together. The road ahead was still unclear, but with Jamie by her side, and with the chance to rewrite the past, Maybe it didn't have to be as hard as she had feared. The world outside continued to spin, but in this quiet moment, Tori knew one thing for certain. She wasn't walking it alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling, each decision Tori made tethering her closer to a future she couldn't quite see, but couldn't ignore. The weight of everything was starting to settle in. The promise she had made to Jamie, the fragile but growing connection with Ethan, and the looming questions about what this all meant for her life moving forward. Every step forward seemed to come with a pull backward, as if the past was unwilling to let her go. It was a Saturday morning when Tori found herself walking down the grand hallway of her office building, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The crisp autumn air had settled in, and the city outside seemed quieter than usual. But inside there was a storm brewing, one that had nothing to do with the weather. The past few days had been a whirlwind. She had spent time with Ethan, cautiously reopening old wounds, allowing herself to entertain the possibility that he might be ready to be part of Jamie's life, and hers. But every moment with him felt like walking a tightrope. He was trying, but she didn't know if it was enough. And Jamie, though he seemed to be warming to Ethan, still had that look in his eyes, the look of a child who wasn't sure how to believe in something that had been absent for so long. Tori couldn't blame him for his hesitancy. She too felt that same wariness, that same reluctance to let her guard down. Ethan had broken her once, and she didn't know if she could allow him to do it again. Her phone buzzed as she entered the elevator. It was a message from Kara. "Lunch today? I need to talk about all this with you. You've been avoiding me." Tori sighed. Kara had been persistent, and though Tori had been avoiding her calls and texts, she knew that today was the day she had to face the truth. She needed to talk about everything: her relationship with Ethan, her future with Jamie, and the overwhelming pressure that came with trying to balance everything. The elevator doors opened and Tori stepped out into the bright, polished lobby. She glanced at her phone again. She needed to make a decision. Could she trust Ethan enough to let him back in, to let him be part of Jamie's life? Or was she just setting herself up for more heartbreak? She met Kara at a trendy cafe just off Fifth Avenue. Kara was already sitting at a corner table, her sleek blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun, her fashionable clothes fitting perfectly into the urban landscape. Kara had always been the kind of woman who seemed to glide through life effortlessly, but Tori could see the concern in her eyes as she looked up. "You've been avoiding me," Kara said, her tone playful but with an edge. "What's going on, Tori? You're not answering your phone, you're not returning messages. Something's off." Tori sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. She hadn't realized how much she needed to talk until now. It wasn't just about Ethan or Jamie, it was about everything. The choices she had made, the choices she had yet to make. "I don't know what to do," Tori said, her voice quiet. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I could handle this on my own. But now everything feels like it's falling apart. I don't know how to balance my career, being a mom, and—" She stopped herself, running a hand through her hair. "And Ethan. He's back in the picture. And I don't know if I can trust him. I don't know if I should let him in again." Kara didn't say anything at first. She just watched Tori with those steady eyes of hers, the kind that always seemed to see through to the heart of things. "Tori," she finally said, her voice soft but firm, "you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders for so long, and now you're trying to figure out whether to open up to someone who has hurt you. But you can't keep doing it all alone. You've built an incredible life, yes, but you're still human. You still need people." Tori's chest tightened. "I don't know if I can trust him again. I've been hurt too many times. And Jamie, he's so young. I can't just drag him into this mess." Kara's expression softened, and she reached across the table to take Tori's hand. "You're not dragging him into anything, Tori. You're giving him a chance at something he's never had. A father. A real father, not just the idea of one. Ethan is here. He's trying. You don't have to forgive him overnight, but don't close the door on something that might be good for you, for Jamie, just because you're afraid of getting hurt again." Tori felt the sting of Kara's words. She had always been the one to keep things in check, to control her world so nothing could threaten the delicate balance she had created. But deep down, she knew Kara was right. She had been so afraid of getting hurt that she had built walls so high that no one could get through, not even herself. "I just want to know if I'm making the right choice," Tori said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this the right thing for Jamie? For me? For us?" Kara leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Only you can answer that, Tori. But I can tell you this. You've spent your whole life putting everyone else's needs before yours. But now, maybe it's time to think about what you need, what you want." Tori looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of Kara's words settle in. It was so easy to get lost in the demands of the world around her, the expectations of being a successful CEO, the responsibilities of motherhood, the fear of being vulnerable again. But what about her? What did she want? What was she truly looking for in all of this? She didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, Tori felt a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life, piece by piece, without sacrificing everything she had worked so hard for. "I don't have all the answers yet," Tori said, looking up at Kara, "but I'm willing to try. I need to let go of the fear. I need to take a chance." Kara smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "That's all anyone can do, Tori. Take a chance. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take it one step at a time." Tori nodded, her chest lighter than it had been in days. She wasn't ready to make any grand decisions just yet, but she was ready to face the truth, to let Ethan back in, to let herself believe in the possibility of a future that didn't have to be perfect, but could still be something real. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love and family could be part of the life she was still building. And that, perhaps, was enough for now. The office was quiet when Tori arrived the next morning, the usual hum of activity subdued, almost as if the building itself was holding its breath. She stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby of her penthouse office building, her heels clicking on the marble floor in rhythm with her racing thoughts. The events of the past week felt like a whirlwind, leaving her exhausted but, for the first time in years, with a sense of possibility hanging in the air. Tori had been living in a limbo of decisions, her life split between her past with Ethan, her present with Jamie, and her future as a CEO. For weeks she had thought she was in control of everything. But now, with Ethan back in her life, and the truth about Jamie's father finally out in the open, nothing felt as certain as it once did. She couldn't deny that the reunion with Ethan had stirred something in her, something she thought she had buried long ago. The truth about Jamie had been the key to unlocking a door she never thought she would open again. But as much as she wanted to believe that they could pick up where they left off, she wasn't sure if that was even possible. Ethan wasn't the same man he had been when they had first met, and neither was she. She pushed the door to her office open, stepping inside. The view of the city skyline stretched before her like a canvas, vast, beautiful, and yet overwhelming. She had always found solace in this office, this space where she could focus on her work and escape the emotional chaos of her personal life. But today it felt different. She couldn't shut the door on the life she had with Ethan, not anymore. Her assistant Claire was already at her desk, looking up as Tori entered. "Good morning, Ms. Hamilton," she said, her tone professional but warm. "There's a meeting in an hour with the board, and I've prepared the final draft for the new investment proposal." "Thanks, Claire. I'll be right with you," Tori said, forcing a smile. She had to get her head in the game. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan, back to the quiet moments they had shared since the wedding, since the truth had come out. The fragile truce they had struck, the tentative rebuilding of trust. It was all still too new, too fragile to count on. As the hour dragged on, Tori found herself staring out the window, trying to refocus her thoughts. The call to her assistant snapped her back to reality. "Ms. Hamilton, the board is ready for the meeting." She took a deep breath, straightening her blazer. The next few hours would require all her focus, nothing less would do. She couldn't afford to let personal matters interfere with her professional life, not when the stakes were this high. The meeting went smoothly, the conversation fluid, but Tori felt like she was operating on autopilot. Numbers, projections, future growth. These were the things she could control, the things that didn't require opening up to anyone, to anything other than business. But as the meeting wrapped up, her thoughts immediately returned to Ethan and Jamie. Would Ethan truly stay? Would he really prove he was worthy of the family they were slowly trying to rebuild? Or was she setting herself up for yet another heartbreak? Her phone buzzed on the table, the vibration pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. It was a text from Ethan. "Can we talk tonight? I need to see you. I'm ready to be there for you and Jamie. I want this to work, Tori." Her stomach twisted at the words. There it was again, the hope, the desire. But could she believe it? Could she believe him? The board members began to file out of the room, and Tori quickly powered off her phone. There was no escaping the choices she had to make. Tonight, they would either solidify the fragile bridge they had begun to build or watch it crumble before they could even take a step across. The evening came too quickly. Tori had spent the entire afternoon running through possible scenarios in her head. What would she say to Ethan? What was she ready to hear from him? They had so much to rebuild, so many pieces of their past to sift through. But above all, she knew she had to confront the truth. Was she ready to let him back in? Was it fair to Jamie, to herself? She arrived at the small restaurant Ethan had chosen for their meeting, a quiet place tucked away on a side street in the city. It was intimate, nothing flashy, just the kind of place that felt like it could hold deep conversations and heavy silences. As she entered, Ethan was already waiting at a corner table, his back to the door, dressed casually in a dark jacket and jeans. He looked up as she approached, his eyes soft, his expression unreadable. "Hi," Tori said, her voice tentative, unsure of how to begin. "Hi," Ethan replied, standing up quickly. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. Nervousness, perhaps, or maybe fear. She couldn't tell. Tori sat down across from him, taking a moment to study his face. Ethan hadn't changed much over the years. He was still the same man she had loved, the same man who had once felt like the center of her world. But now the distance between them felt like miles, emotional miles, built up over time. "I don't know where to start," Tori said, leaning forward slightly. "There's so much to say, so much to figure out. I can't just pretend this is easy." "I don't want you to pretend, Tori," Ethan said softly. "I don't expect things to be easy. I just want a chance. A real chance to make things right. To be part of your life, of Jamie's life." Tori studied him for a long moment. Could she trust him? Could she let him back in? She had spent so many years building this life, this career, where she was in control. Letting Ethan in, letting him be part of their future, meant giving up control in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. But then she remembered Jamie, his quiet smile, the way he had opened his heart to Ethan so effortlessly, and she realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about creating the family Jamie deserved, a family that wasn't defined by absence and regret. "I can't promise anything, Ethan," Tori said, her voice soft but firm. "But I'm willing to try. For Jamie, for us. But you need to understand that this isn't going to be easy. You have to prove you're here to stay." "I will," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I will, Tori. I'm not going anywhere this time." Tori felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, both a relief and a challenge. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, or maybe it was another false start. She didn't know. But she was ready to take the first step. For Jamie. For them. And for herself. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted, and for the first time in a long time, Tori felt a flicker of hope. Hope that perhaps the future they were building together could be different. Not perfect, but real. And maybe that was enough. The city had already begun to slip into its nighttime rhythm when Tori left the restaurant. The evening had gone as she had expected, filled with the heavy weight of words left unspoken for years. Ethan had apologized, made promises, and shown her the same vulnerability that had been buried beneath his wealth and power for so long. But for all the promises, the words, the careful hope in his eyes, Tori still wasn't sure if she was ready. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again. She had spent too long fighting alone to let someone back in so easily. She couldn't just undo the years of heartache, the years of walking the tightrope between success and loneliness, trying to build a life for Jamie without Ethan. Could she really open her heart again to the man who had walked away? As she stepped into the back of her car, her phone buzzed. Tori glanced at it, half expecting it to be a message from Ethan, some last plea, but it was something else, an email from her team at the office. "Urgent. Board meeting tomorrow. A change in the deal. Your immediate attention required." Her stomach churned. The merger, the one she had fought so hard for, was on the brink of collapse. She had known this was coming, the pressure, the constant negotiations. But now, staring at the email, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility bear down on her. She wasn't just a mother, a businesswoman, a CEO. She was everything to everyone, and the reality of it was suffocating. Her thoughts were a whirlwind as the car glided through the streets of Manhattan, past the shimmering lights and the towering buildings that had once filled her with pride. Now, they only reminded her of everything she had fought for and everything she had lost in the process. The tension between her career and her personal life had never been this sharp, this painful. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the one who never let her emotions dictate her actions. But lately, everything felt out of balance. The car slowed to a stop in front of her penthouse. Tori stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she made her way to the elevator. The apartment was quiet when she stepped inside, the only sound the soft hum of the city below. She glanced at the pile of papers on her kitchen counter, contracts, reports, and proposals that demanded her attention. But tonight, nothing seemed more pressing than the storm inside her. She ran her fingers through her hair, frustrated. This wasn't supposed to be hard. She had always been able to compartmentalize, to separate work from life. But now, with Ethan's return and Jamie's newfound relationship with him, the lines had blurred. She couldn't pretend anymore that everything was simple, that she could just keep her heart locked away and keep pushing forward. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from Jamie. "Hey, Mom, can I talk to you about something?" Tori's heart twisted. It had been a few days since Jamie had openly spoken to her about Ethan. Since the initial shock, Jamie had been quiet, retreating into himself in ways that Tori hadn't expected. He was trying to process everything, his feelings about his father, about Ethan being a part of his life. The fear of losing her, of being caught in between them, was something Tori could feel in the silence that had grown between them. She sat down on the couch, scrolling through the message again. "Can we talk?" Tori sighed, picking up the phone to respond. "Of course, sweetie, I'll be here. Come home, we'll talk." A few minutes later, the door opened, and Jamie stepped inside, his small frame looking even smaller against the backdrop of the grand apartment. He had always been the center of her world, but now it felt as if they were both drifting in different directions. Jamie sat down beside her, his legs pulled up to his chest. There was something about his stillness, his quiet gaze, that made Tori's heart ache. "Mom, I don't know what to feel anymore," Jamie said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I'm glad Ethan's here, but I don't know what's real anymore." Tori swallowed, feeling a lump form in her throat. This was it. The conversation she had been dreading. "I know, honey," Tori said softly, reaching for his hand. "I know it's a lot to take in. It's a lot for all of us." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm always going to be here. I'm not going anywhere." Jamie looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. "But are you okay with it, Mom? With him?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment Tori was silent. Was she okay with it? Could she be okay with Ethan being a part of their lives again? Could she really let him back in after everything? The anger, the betrayal, the years of being alone. Could she undo all of that? "I'm trying, Jamie," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to make sense of it all. I'm trying to figure out what's best for you, for both of us. And I need you to know that no matter what happens with Ethan, I will always put you first. You're my priority. You always will be." Jamie nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a bit. "I know, Mom. I just don't want to mess things up. I don't want you to be sad again, Dad." Tori's heart clenched, and she pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly as if to reassure herself as much as him. "You're not going to mess anything up, Jamie. You've never messed anything up. You've been so strong through all of this. I'm proud of you. You know that?" Jamie pulled away slightly, looking at her with a small smile. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. I know you've been working really hard, and I guess I just want everything to work out, you know, for all of us." Tori smiled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I do too, honey. I do too." As they sat together in the quiet of the apartment, Tori couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't have all the answers, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had Jamie, she had Ethan, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new, something real. The choices ahead were still daunting, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in years, Tori allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more, something that wasn't perfect, but something that could be enough. And for now, that was enough. The morning light spilled through the curtains of Tori's penthouse, casting long shadows across the floor. The city outside hummed with its usual energy, cars honking, the occasional shout, the distant whoosh of the subway beneath the streets. But inside, it was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The peacefulness felt fragile, as if the calm before the storm was just moments away. Tori had spent the night thinking about everything. Her conversation with Jamie, the uncertainty of her future with Ethan, and the looming decision she still hadn't been able to make. She knew that today would be the tipping point, the day when everything had to be sorted. She couldn't keep dragging her feet. She had to decide if she was ready to open her heart again, or if she would continue to keep Ethan at arm's length. Ethan had been calling, texting, sending messages full of promises, asking if they could meet again, talk again. He was ready, or so he said. But was she? Was she ready to let him into their lives, into the fragile world she had built with Jamie? Tori had spent years building walls around herself, around Jamie. The walls had been necessary. They had kept her safe, protected her from the pain of unfulfilled promises, from the loneliness that came with raising a child alone, from the scars that still lingered from the betrayal she had felt when Ethan walked away. But now, with him back in her life, with Jamie needing answers and needing something from her, the walls felt suffocating. She had to face the truth. Ethan wasn't the same man who had walked away from her all those years ago, and she wasn't the same woman who had once loved him so fiercely. They had both changed, but could they rebuild what they had lost? Tori stood up from the kitchen counter, brushing a hand through her hair, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She glanced at her phone again, her finger hovering over the screen. She had been avoiding his calls. It was easier that way, easier to keep him at arm's length. But was it fair to do that? To keep pretending like she didn't care? Another message from Ethan flashed on the screen. "Please, Tori, I need you to hear me out. I can't move forward without you." The words hit her hard. She knew he was trying, but was it enough? Did she still love him? Or was the love she felt now a ghost of what they had once shared? And what about Jamie? Could she risk their fragile dynamic for the sake of something that might only bring more heartache? The sound of a door opening interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Jamie standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Mom?" he asked, his voice soft, hesitant. He had been quiet in the days following their conversation about Ethan. Quiet, but not distant, but she could tell that something was weighing on him. Tori motioned for him to come in, feeling her chest tighten at the sight of his serious expression. "Hey, sweetie, what's on your mind?" Jamie hesitated before sitting down beside her on the couch, his eyes flicking to her phone. "Is it him again?" he asked, his voice low. Tori exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah, he wants to meet, wants to talk. But I don't know, Jamie. I don't know if I'm ready to have him in our lives again." Jamie looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "I get it, Mom. I really do. I've been thinking about it too. I don't know if I'm ready for all this either." He paused, his gaze searching her face. "But I want him to be here. I want him to try. I think I deserve that." "We both do." Tori's heart ached at his words. How could she argue with that? He deserved so much more than the fragmented picture of a family that she had tried so hard to protect him from. She had kept him away from the hurt, but in doing so, had she also kept him from the possibility of something real? Something whole? "I know you're right," she said quietly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "But I need to make sure it's the right thing for you, for us. I can't just rush into it. I need to know that he's really here to stay." Jamie smiled, the warmth in his eyes making Tori's chest tighten. "I think he wants to, Mom. He just needs a little help. Maybe he doesn't know how to do it, but if he's trying, that's enough for me." Tori nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in her throat. It wasn't easy to admit, but Jamie was right. Ethan was trying, and maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. As Tori leaned back against the couch, her mind drifted to the many conversations she and Ethan had shared. She had listened to his promises, seen the sincerity in his eyes. But trust wasn't something she could just hand over. It wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It would take time, effort, mutual understanding. And even then, there was no guarantee that everything would work out. But she couldn't keep living in the past either. She couldn't keep shutting herself off from the possibility of happiness, of family, of something real. I'll meet with him, Tori said, her voice steady. I'll listen. I'll see if he's ready to prove he's really in this for the long haul, but I won't rush into anything. Not for his sake. Not for mine. For us. It has to be right. Jamie nodded, the corners of his lips curling into a soft smile. Thanks, Mom, he said, wrapping his arms around her. I think this is the right thing to do. For all of us. Tori hugged him back, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer seemed as terrifying. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers right now. Maybe it was about taking that first step, with no guarantees, no promises, and seeing where it led. She wasn't ready to give Ethan everything. She wasn't ready to just let him back into her life without proving himself. But she was ready to take the risk. For Jamie. For the future they could build together, even if it meant facing the unknown. And as she sat there, holding her son, the weight of her decisions felt a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. The next evening, Tori found herself standing in front of the sleek, modern restaurant that Ethan had chosen for their meeting. It was the kind of place where the ambiance was as important as the food. Chandeliers overhead, soft jazz playing in the background, and the kind of quiet elegance that whispered of wealth and power. She had always preferred quieter spots, places where the noise of the world could be filtered out. But tonight, there was no escaping the weight of everything. The weight of her past with Ethan, the weight of the future she was trying to build, and the weight of the decision she still wasn't sure she was ready to make. Jamie had been supportive, encouraging her to give Ethan a chance. But Tori knew that this wasn't just about Jamie. It was about her. It was about whether she could look at Ethan and see him not just as the man who had left her, but as the man he had become, and whether she could let herself love him again. As Tori stepped inside the restaurant, the host led her through the dimly lit space, past elegantly set tables and couples deep in conversation. It all seemed so foreign to her now, as if the world she had once inhabited had lost its familiar charm. And then she saw him. Ethan sat at a table near the window, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. He looked more relaxed than she had seen him in years. Casual, almost vulnerable in the way he sat, his jacket discarded over the back of the chair, sleeves rolled up as if he were no longer trying to fit into a role. He was just a man waiting for her, and for the first time Tori felt the possibility of seeing him as that. Just a man. When he saw her approach, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, something between hope and uncertainty. He stood up, smiling softly, though it was clear he was just as unsure as she was. "Hey," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. "I'm glad you came." Tori smiled back, though the gesture felt distant. "I had to," she said, sitting down opposite him. "We need to talk, Ethan." He nodded, setting his glass down and leaning forward, his expression open, waiting for her words. Tori took a breath, searching for the right way to begin. This conversation had been building for days, and now that they were face to face, everything felt even more complicated than she had imagined. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. "About you, about Jamie, about what this could mean for us. I've spent so many years thinking I could do this on my own, thinking I was better off without you. But the truth is, I don't know. I don't know if I can trust you again." Ethan's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt her. He let her speak, his eyes never leaving hers, full of the sincerity that had become a constant in his voice. "I know I hurt you, Tori. I've always known. I've spent years trying to make up for it, in ways that probably didn't matter. But the truth is, I wasn't the man I should have been. I wasn't the man you needed." Tori nodded, looking down at her hands, feeling a pang of something she couldn't name. She had built so much of her life around the idea that she didn't need anyone, that she could handle everything on her own. But sitting here in front of Ethan, she realized just how fragile that belief was. "I don't know if I can do this again," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking. "I don't know if I can trust you with my heart. With Jamie's heart. You've been absent for so long, and now you want to come back in. You want to be part of our lives, but I don't know if I'm ready to let that happen." Ethan reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers, but he didn't touch her. It was as though he was waiting for permission, waiting for her to decide if they could move forward. "I know I can't erase the past, Tori. I can't undo what I've done. But what I can do is show you that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking you to forgive me overnight. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove that I can be what you and Jamie need." Tori took a deep breath, her chest tight with emotion. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man sitting in front of her was the same person she had once loved, but now there was too much history, too many unanswered questions. Her life had moved on without him, and the idea of letting him back in felt like breaking open a door that had been sealed shut for so long. But then she remembered Jamie, his face, his quiet vulnerability, the way he had reached out for her support. He was willing to try, willing to give Ethan a chance. How could she do any less for him? "I'm not asking for everything, Tori," Ethan continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I'm asking for a chance to be part of your life, to be part of Jamie's life. I'm not asking for you to forget, but to trust me again. Trust that I won't walk away. Trust that I won't leave you again." Tori looked up at him, feeling the weight of his words, the sincerity in his eyes. The question wasn't whether she could forgive him. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about whether she could allow herself to love him again, even with all the uncertainty, even with all the pain. Her heart was still guarded, still afraid of being hurt again. But as she looked at Ethan, the man who had once been her everything and had become a stranger, she realized that the only way forward was to take a leap of faith, to trust in the possibility of something new. "I'm not ready to promise you everything," Tori said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'm willing to try, for Jamie, for us. We'll take it one step at a time." Ethan's eyes softened and he reached for her hand, finally closing the distance between them. "That's all I'm asking for," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And for the first time in years, Tori allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something real, something built not just on past promises, but on the potential for a future they would create together, piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she was willing to let go of the past and step into the unknown. Together. It was a crisp evening in early spring when Tori stood at the edge of Central Park, the city skyline just beyond the trees, illuminated by the setting sun. The park, once a symbol of all the moments she had walked alone, now felt different. The air was filled with the faint scent of blooming flowers, and for the first time in what seemed like years, Tori felt the weight of everything, her fears, her regrets, her uncertainties, lifted from her shoulders. The future didn't feel so daunting anymore. It felt like a choice. The past few weeks had been nothing short of transformative. After their last conversation, after Ethan had left her the space to think, to feel, and to finally confront the raw emotions she had buried for so long, Tori had realized something. It wasn't just about forgiving Ethan. It was about forgiving herself. It was about giving herself permission to be vulnerable, to love again, without fearing the pain that might come with it. She had spent too long hiding behind walls of control, believing that if she could just keep her emotions in check, if she could just focus on her work and her son, She wouldn't need anyone else. But in trying to protect herself, she had closed herself off from everything else. And that wasn't the life she wanted anymore. Ethan had proven himself, slowly but surely. He had worked to regain her trust, not just through words, but through actions. He had been patient with her, had respected her space, and had slowly, tentatively, rebuilt the bridge that had once seemed impossible to cross. Jamie had welcomed him with cautious arms, but his smile had softened, his eyes filled with something that had been missing for so long: hope. Now, as she stood in the park waiting for him, Tori knew what she had to do. She couldn't wait any longer. The door she had closed so tightly in the past was now cracked open, and beyond it was the life she had always wanted, the life she could finally begin to build. Not alone, but with the people who mattered most. The sound of footsteps behind her pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Ethan approaching, his hands in his pockets, his smile warm but tinged with uncertainty. He looked different, softer, more genuine, but still the man she had once loved. His presence didn't feel like a shadow anymore. It felt like something she was ready to embrace. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his eyes lighting up as they met hers. Tori smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I'm just glad you're here," she said, her voice steady, yet filled with something deeper, something she had worked so hard to find again. "I've been thinking a lot about where we go from here, about what comes next for us." Ethan's expression softened, his gaze unwavering. "I don't have all the answers, Tori, but I know that I want to be part of your life, and Jamie's. I want to be here for you, to support you. I know I've asked for a lot, and I don't expect you to forget the past, but I'm ready to try. For real this time." Tori's heart swelled. She had feared this moment, feared that she would be asked to make a choice she wasn't ready for. But now, standing here, the answer seemed clearer than ever. "I'm ready too," she said quietly, stepping closer to him. "I've spent too long holding on to the past, to the fear of getting hurt again. But what I've realized is that if we keep living in the shadows of what we lost, we'll never have a chance at something new. I want to try, Ethan. I want us to try, for Jamie's sake, for ours." Ethan's eyes softened, a look of relief and joy crossing his features. He reached out, taking her hands in his. "You won't regret it, I promise. I'm not perfect, but I'm here. I'm here for the long haul." Tori smiled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease, feeling the weight of the past dissolve into something lighter, something hopeful. "I'm not asking for perfection," she said softly. "I'm asking for honesty, for effort, for love." As Ethan nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace, Tori closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his presence settle in her bones. The city around them was still bustling, still moving at its relentless pace. But in this moment, with the man she had once loved, with the boy who had filled her life with purpose, everything felt right. It wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about taking that first step forward, together. A few weeks later, Tori stood in the living room of her penthouse, looking out at the city skyline once more. This time, however, the view felt different. It felt like a beginning, not an ending. Jamie had spent the afternoon with Ethan, the two of them bonding over a shared love of basketball and video games. It was still new, still awkward at times, but Tori could see the progress. She could see the way Jamie was starting to open up to Ethan in a way he hadn't before. There were still moments of hesitation, but the cracks in their walls were slowly being filled with trust. And for Tori, that was everything. Ethan walked in, his hand outstretched. "You ready for dinner?" he asked, his smile warm and genuine. He looked at her, not as a distant figure from her past, but as someone she was learning to build a future with. It wasn't perfect, It wasn't easy, but it felt real. Tori took his hand, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and excitement. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady, the words carrying the weight of everything she had come to realize. "I'm ready." As they walked toward the kitchen, Tori glanced back at Jamie, who was sitting on the couch with a big grin on his face. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt so heavy. For the first time in years, Tori allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new, something better. And as she sat down for dinner that night, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Tori knew that she had made the right choice. Love wasn't always easy. It wasn't always perfect. But it was worth the risk. For her, for Jamie, and for the life they were creating together. And in that moment, Tori Hamilton knew that the future was theirs to write, one step at a time, one day at a time.